The night was alive with fire and music. Lanterns swung high above the crowded square, their flickering glow casting long, distorted shadows over the cobblestone streets. Masked dancers twirled in drunken delight while the noblemen, draped in silks and gold, paraded through the carnival like kings among peasants. Wine spilled as laughter erupted in every corner, the sound of flutes and drums blending into a feverish symphony. It was the midnight carnival, the one evening of the year when rank and rule were blurred beneath masks, when sins could be hidden under velvet cloaks, and when the city forgot its hunger and sorrow in favor of indulgence. But on this particular night, the masks concealed more than drunken smiles and secret affairs. Behind one, there lurked a different intention, silent, deliberate, sharpened like the edge of a blade. While nobles feasted and peasants strained to catch a glimpse of the revelry, the air itself seemed to pulse with something darker, as if death had slipped into the celebration unseen. It began subtly, like a whisper no one noticed. A noble vanished from the throng, drawn away by the promise of secrecy, perhaps the lure of desire or forbidden temptation. Minutes later, another followed, never to return. At first, no one cared. The carnival was chaotic, and disappearances went unnoticed amidst the swirl of music and wine. Yet in the dim alleys and quiet corners, 13 men, pillars of wealth, arrogance, and cruelty, were meeting the same fate. Their laughter was cut short, their throats opened by a hand both merciless and precise. As the night deepened, a strange tension crept into the square. A servant stumbled back into the crowd, face pale, clothes soaked in crimson. A scream pierced through the music, sharp enough to silence even the drummers. The carnival froze. One by one, the torches illuminated a grisly revelation. Bodies sprawled like broken dolls, throats slit cleanly, blood spreading across the stones in glistening pools. Wine and blood mixed together in the gutters, indistinguishable in the dim light. The nobles who only moments ago mocked the executioner's trade now lay silent in death, their masks still fixed in frozen expressions of arrogance. Panic spread like fire. Some fled the square, trampling each other in terror, while others tore away their masks, desperate to prove they were not marked for death. The carnival music had collapsed into chaos, flutes discarded, drums overturned, the joyous noise replaced by shrieks and desperate prayers. But somewhere, hidden in the swirl of fear, the killer stood. Not a phantom, not a man from the shadows, but a woman, a daughter whose life had been defined by steel and silence. The executioner's daughter. She had slipped into the celebration unnoticed, her face covered like all the others, her presence invisible among the masks. Yet while the nobles drank to their untouchable power, she carried something far deadlier than indulgence. Each step she took had been rehearsed. Each life she ended carried meaning beyond cruelty. For her, this was no night of revelry. This was judgment. Witnesses would later whisper of her calmness, of how she moved without hesitation, as though guided by fate. They said her hand never trembled, that her blade struck with the same certainty as her father's axe upon the scaffold. Some claimed her eyes were as cold as winter steel. Others swore they saw fire in them, as if vengeance itself had taken human form. By the time guards forced their way through the panicked masses, 13 nobles lay dead. The number was no accident. 13. Each one chosen, each one marked for sins they thought hidden behind their gold and titles. And in that instant, the midnight carnival was transformed forever. What was once a spectacle of joy became a slaughterhouse of shame. The people who had gathered to laugh and drink now found themselves standing in the aftermath of a massacre. The torches flickered weakly, smoke rising like a funeral pyre over the square. Mothers clutched their children, drunkards sobered in shock, and the surviving nobles huddled together in fear, realizing that their wealth and rank had not shielded them from the reach of death. At the center of it all was the figure who had orchestrated the night of blood. The executioner's daughter, long treated as a pariah, had stepped out from the shadows of her cursed lineage to leave her own mark upon history, written not in ink, but in blood. Her story would echo through the centuries, whispered in taverns and courtrooms alike, a tale of hatred born in silence, of vengeance unleashed beneath carnival lights, and of a woman who dared to wield the very blade that society had forced her to grow up beside. The Midnight Carnival would never be remembered for its music or its laughter again. Its legacy was now carved into the cobblestones where nobles once danced, a legacy drenched in crimson. And at the heart of it, like the opening act to a tragedy yet to unfold, stood the name of the girl who slit 13 throats before the eyes of a city too drunk to see her coming. Her story does not begin with that night, it ends there. But to understand why the executioner's daughter turned the carnival into a slaughterhouse, one must step back into the shadows where she was born, into the life of stigma, cruelty, and quiet rage that shaped her hand into the blade of justice and madness. Her story truly begins in the place where most stories would prefer to end, in the shadow of the gallows. The first sounds she ever heard as an infant were not the lullabies of a mother's voice or the gentle whispers of affection, but the roar of a crowd demanding blood. Her father was the city's executioner, a man whose hands were always stained with death, whose name was never spoken without a shiver. To the crown and its laws, he was essential, a necessary tool of justice. But to the people, he was cursed. The man who severed heads, who hanged thieves, who burned witches. He was no better than the condemned themselves. And because she was his child, she was marked with the same invisible stain. From the earliest days of her childhood, she lived apart from others. The neighbors never let their children play with her. Merchants hesitated to sell bread to her father's family, muttering that the stink of blood followed them into the marketplace. Even the church, the one place meant for all souls, forced them to sit in the last row, their heads bowed not from reverence but from shame. She grew up watching her father endure this silent exile with grim acceptance, as if he understood that his service to the city condemned not only him, but his bloodline forever. She remembered standing in the small wooden room they called home, staring at the heavy boots her father wore when he walked to the scaffold. She had heard his axe sharpened late into the night, the grinding sound like a lullaby of steel, echoing through the walls as she drifted to sleep. She never saw fear in his eyes, only the weight of inevitability. He had long since surrendered to the knowledge that he was both needed and despised, tolerated only because the rulers required his hand to carry out their sentences. The people spat when he passed, yet they cheered when his blade fell. And while he carried his shame in silence, she carried it differently. Children can endure hunger, even cold, but what she could not endure was humiliation. She remembered being dragged from school by the hair, mocked as the butcher's spawn. She remembered the way noble boys would sneer at her, taunting that one day she would grow up to marry a hangman or a gravedigger, because no one else would touch her cursed blood. She carried those words with her like scars carved into her very soul. Her mother's love was the only light in her early life, though even that light was dim and fleeting. Her mother, too, was marked by association, pitted by some, despised by others. In whispered moments, she tried to reassure her daughter that she was not defined by her father's profession, that she could choose her own path. But illness took her too soon, leaving the girl alone with a father who did not know how to nurture, only how to endure. In the silence that followed her mother's death, bitterness took root in the child's heart. And yet, growing up in the shadow of the scaffold gave her an education unlike any other. While noble children were schooled in poetry, manners, and the art of command, she learned the anatomy of the human body from watching her father work. She knew where veins pulsed beneath the skin, where an axe must strike to end a life cleanly, how long it took for a body to hang before breath gave way to stillness. Death became as familiar to her as bread or water. She did not recoil from it, because it was the only inheritance she had ever been given. Still, she was not without imagination. She would sit by the window and watch the nobility ride past in their carriages, dressed in silks and jewels, their laughter echoing through the streets as if the world itself belonged to them. She longed for that life, not because she wished for riches, but because she wished for freedom. Freedom from the sneers, from the pointed fingers, from the whispered curses that followed her every step. She dreamed of removing her mask of shame and replacing it with a mask of power. As she grew older, her resentment sharpened. She began to notice that the very nobles who laughed at her father's profession were the same ones who delivered men and women to him. Their judgments filled his hands with work, yet they looked down upon him for carrying out what they themselves decreed. Hypocrisy dripped from every corner of their smiles, and the young girl began to see the nobles not as protectors of order, but as predators cloaked in finery. By the time she reached womanhood, her heart had hardened into something dangerous. The humiliation of her youth, the absence of her mother, the cold indifference of society, all converged into a single truth. She was not meant to be a daughter of light. She was a child of shadows, molded by the rhythm of the axe and the silence of the crowd that condemned her before she could even speak. And yet, within those shadows, something else stirred, a resolve that went beyond bitterness. She did not want to simply endure as her father had endured. She wanted to strike back. She wanted to make the nobles, the same ones who mocked her and used her father as their instrument, taste the very blade they had forced upon her family. Thus, the foundation of her fate was laid. She was a child born into blood, raised in exile, and shaped by a world that treated her existence as a curse. Society had placed a mask upon her face long before she would ever don one at the carnival. But where others saw only disgrace, she began to see possibility. In her silence, she was already sharpening not just knives, but her will. The executioner's daughter was not destined to remain a victim of scorn. Step by step, humiliation would forge her into something far more dangerous than anyone suspected. She would carry the shadows of her childhood into adulthood, and with them, she would carve her own name into history, not as a forgotten outcast, but as a figure whose vengeance would drench the carnival in crimson. The Midnight Carnival was not just a festival. It was a mirror, one polished in gold and laughter, yet cracked by rot that few dared to acknowledge. On the surface, it was the crown's great offering to the people, one night of freedom when the laws of class seemed to blur, when masks gave commoners a chance to mingle with nobles, when music and wine flowed like rivers across the cobblestone streets. But beneath the glowing lanterns and painted masks, the carnival was something darker. It was a stage upon which corruption paraded itself openly, where indulgence disguised as merriment concealed the very sins that ruled the city. For weeks, anticipation built. Merchants decorated their stalls with crimson banners and strings of bells. Actors rehearsed grotesque performances, jugglers sharpened their knives, and brewers prepared barrels of strong wine meant to loosen tongues and stiffen courage. The city square, usually grim with markets and hangings, transformed into a palace of flame and song. But for the nobles, the carnival was never truly about joy. It was about domination. While peasants scrambled for crumbs of excitement, the nobles turned the event into a theater of power, flaunting wealth that most would never touch, hiding their true faces behind intricate masks adorned with jewels, feathers, and gilded patterns. To the ordinary eye, the masks seemed playful, an opportunity to shed identity for a night. But in reality, the masks only amplified what the wearers already were: predators cloaked in velvet, wolves who laughed at their prey. The executioner's daughter saw this more clearly than anyone else. To her, every mask was not a disguise but a revelation, a symbol of how hypocrisy ruled. And within this grand masquerade, there were 13 who stood apart, 13 noblemen whose arrogance towered above the rest. Each had his mask, each had his role, but all shared one trait: they believed themselves untouchable. The first was Lord Vaynar, a man whose lands stretched far beyond the city gates, whose wealth came not from toil, but from grinding farmers into dust. He wore a mask shaped like a lion, mane gilded, teeth bared in eternal roar. To the crowd, he was magnificent. To those who owed him tithes, he was a beast who devoured without end. Next was Sir Albrecht, the commander of the guard, who had spilled more blood in taverns than in battlefields. His mask was bronze, polished into the sneer of a soldier, but beneath it was a man who sold justice for bribes and crushed the poor with the same iron heel he claimed to raise against enemies. There was also Count Rudin, whose fortune came from the salt trade, though whispers said his ships carried more than salt. His mask gleamed with mirrored glass, a reflection meant to blind, yet behind it were eyes that watched young girls like a hawk circling prey. He was infamous in whispers, though his crimes were never spoken aloud in court. Another was the bishop's brother, a man who wore the robes of piety during the day and a jester's mask at night. He dealt in absolution like coin, selling forgiveness to the wealthy while condemning the poor to eternal flames. At the carnival, He drank as if salvation itself was something he could drown. One by one, their faces parade through history, though at the time, the city pretended not to see. They were men who believed themselves immortal, men who danced through the carnival like gods among insects. Their laughter was crueler, their games more vicious. Where commoners sang and drank for joy, these nobles sought only to mock, to humiliate, to remind the people that even in masks, power belonged to them. Yet the carnival was more than drunken games and public cruelty. It was also a place of secrecy. In dim alleys behind the torches, deals were made, land sold, debts forgiven, marriages arranged, even murders plotted. It was said that one could walk into the carnival with nothing and emerge with the fate of an entire family decided. The nobles hid their sins beneath music, but the executioner's daughter had learned to listen between the notes. She knew of Lord Vaynar's cruelty to peasants. She knew of Count Rudin's hunting parties that ended not with deer, but with missing servant girls. She knew the bishop's brother had sold confessions to enemies for coin. Each of the 13 carried sins carved deep into the bones of the city, sins that had left scars on the common people. To the peasants, these men were distant lords whose cruelty could never be challenged. To her, they were prey. And so, when the midnight carnival began that fateful year, the stage was already set. Fireworks burst overhead, showering the sky with sparks that looked like falling stars. Jugglers tossed flaming torches into the night, their shadows leaping across the cobbles. Musicians pounded drums that made the stones vibrate beneath dancing feet. The nobles moved through it all like emperors, their jeweled masks catching the torchlight, their cloaks brushing against the dirt without shame. The executioner's daughter stood among them, unseen. To most, she was just another mask, another figure in the crowd. But inside her mind, each drumbeat counted down, each torch flicker lit the path of her vengeance. The carnival that to others symbolized joy and freedom became to her a hunting ground. She studied her prey from across the square. Lord Vaynar roared with laughter as he forced a farmer to drink until he collapsed. Sir Albrecht boasted of battles he had never fought, daring servants to strike him while he jeered. Count Rudin disappeared behind silken curtains with a trembling maid. The bishop's brother blessed cups of wine with mock prayers before spilling half across the ground. Each noble revealed himself not in spite of his mask, but because of it. The carnival stripped away the last pretense of civility. For the executioner's daughter, these sights were confirmation, not surprise. She had lived her entire life watching the hypocrisy of nobles who spat upon her father while demanding his acts serve their judgments. But now, she saw them gathered together in one place, laughing, boasting, sinning beneath the same stars. They believed themselves untouchable, safe behind their masks and their titles. Yet in their arrogance, they had gathered like cattle waiting for slaughter. The carnival lights burned bright, but to her, the night was darker than ever. In that darkness, she found clarity. The music no longer sounded like joy, but like a funeral procession, drums beating not for dance, but for death. The masks no longer looked festive, but grotesque, painted faces grinning like skulls. The nobles no longer looked untouchable. They looked vulnerable, unarmed, intoxicated, careless. And she knew then that the carnival was not just a celebration. It was an opportunity. The opportunity to turn masks into shrouds, to transform laughter into screams, to take the sins of 13 nobles and balance them with 13 blades across 13 throats. The city believed the carnival was a symbol of unity, a single night when all people, rich and poor, mingled together. But for her, it was the opposite. It was proof that unity was a lie, that the gap between noble and commoner was carved deeper than any wound. The carnival was a stage, and on this stage, she would perform her role, not as the outcast daughter of an executioner, but as the executioner herself. And as fireworks lit the sky with flames of red and gold, no one in the city suspected that their celebration was already drenched in blood they had not yet seen. From the moment she could walk, death surrounded her like a second skin. Most children learned games and laughter. She learned silence, the weight of footsteps leading to the scaffold, the tension that gripped the air when a sentence was about to be carried out. Her father never meant to make her his apprentice. Executioners did not dream of passing their work to their daughters. But proximity is its own form of education, and she absorbed everything. She learned not by instruction, but by watching. When her father whet his axe against the grindstone, she studied the angle, the rhythm, the sound that sang like steel sighing. When he tested the edge against his thumb, she saw the droplet of blood bead and understood that sharpness was both science and art. She noticed how he tied the noose, how he adjusted the knot to break a neck cleanly rather than strangle. And she listened to the condemned, their prayers, their curses, their sobs. From them, she learned how fear smelled, how desperation twisted the human voice into something that no hymn could ever reproduce. At first, she was only an observer, but as the years bled forward, she became more than that. She began to practice in secret. While other girls embroidered cloth or plucked at lutes, she stole knives from her father's table and tested their weight. She carved lines into wood, imagining flesh. She studied animals, gutting chickens, skinning rabbits, not because she delighted in cruelty, but because she needed to know how muscle and tendon yielded to a blade. With each cut, she shed the innocence of childhood, replacing it with precision. Her father never spoke much of his feelings, but he noticed. One evening, when she was 14, he caught her balancing his axe across her shoulders, her fingers tracing the grooves in its handle. His face darkened, but he said nothing. Instead, he placed the axe back on the wall, then left her in silence. Perhaps he hoped she would grow out of it, that she would turn her hands to weaving or prayer. But she did not. Instead, her obsession deepened. By the time she reached her 17th year, she was no longer merely practicing motions. She was training her mind. She learned to quiet her breath, to steady her pulse, to move in silence. She taught herself to walk as her father did when he approached the scaffold, deliberate, measured, unstoppable. She rehearsed scenarios in her head. What to do if someone turned too quickly, if a victim cried out, if blood sprayed farther than expected. She was no longer a girl curious about her father's trade. She was becoming a weapon, and she knew it. But there was another lesson, one more subtle than the handling of steel. It was the lesson of detachment. She learned it by watching her father's face after an execution. He did not smile. He did not grimace. He simply wiped his blade, washed his hands, and returned home in silence. She understood that killing was not meant to be performed with passion, but with clarity. A hand that trembled could miss its mark. A heart that hesitated could lose its nerve. To kill well was to kill without feeling. This realization frightened her at first, but soon it became part of her nature. Where others might cry at the sight of blood, she only stared. Where others flinched at the sound of bones breaking, she listened. And yet, she was not her father. For him, death was duty. For her, it was possibility. Her father killed because the crown demanded it. She killed in her imagination because she wanted to. Each slight she had suffered, each insult burned into her memory, became a ghost she rehearsed upon. She envisioned the faces of mocking noble boys in the place of chickens she slaughtered. She saw the laughter of sneering women in the carcasses she gutted. Her training was not only physical, but psychological, sharpening her hatred into something precise, something ready. What made her most dangerous was not the blade in her hand, but the mask she wore in daily life. Outwardly, she was silent, subdued, even docile. She played the part of the outcast girl who kept her eyes lowered, who endured mockery without reply. But inwardly, she was calculating. She knew how to make herself invisible, how to slip unnoticed through a room. The city had trained her in humiliation, and she twisted that into skill. No one saw her as a threat, and that was exactly what made her lethal. At times, she felt herself slipping further away from what others called humanity. She wondered if she still felt the world as others did. When her father executed men, the crowd gasped or cheered, but she only studied. Was she still capable of compassion? Or had the years in the shadow of the gallows hollowed her out? These questions haunted her in quiet moments, but they did not stop her. If anything, they hardened her. For what did compassion bring her mother? Death. What did kindness bring her father? Spit in the streets. What did mercy bring her? Nothing but ridicule. If compassion was weakness, she would sever it as cleanly as a rope from a neck. It was during these years of transformation that her resolve crystallized. She saw her life as a blade forged in fire. Every insult, every humiliation, every lonely night was heat that shaped her. Her secret practices were the hammer striking again and again. And slowly, she sharpened into something her father never intended. Not an apprentice executioner, but a silent predator, biding her time. Her opportunity came into focus when she began to hear whispers of the midnight carnival. Each year, she listened as the city buzzed about its grandeur. And each year, she imagined herself there, not as a spectator but as a participant, not with laughter, but with silence. The carnival was perfect, masks everywhere, chaos masking footsteps, wine dulling senses, nobles exposing themselves in arrogance. If she ever chose to strike, there would never be a better stage. And so she prepared. She selected the tools she would use, not her father's heavy axe, which was too cumbersome, too obvious. She favored smaller blades, sharp enough to cut throats with precision, easy enough to hide beneath a cloak. She practiced drawing them swiftly, striking in the space between breaths. She rehearsed how to silence a man before he could scream, how to blend back into a crowd without suspicion. Years of training culminated in her transformation. She was no longer the cursed daughter hiding behind her father's shadow. She had become her own shadow, moving with intent, breathing vengeance. Where once she was the object of ridicule, she now felt herself standing apart, armed with the kind of knowledge no noble, no priest, no merchant could ever fathom. She had been shaped by death itself, and now she intended to wield it on her own terms. By the time the carnival approached, she was ready. Every insult she had swallowed became a blade. Every humiliation became fuel. She was no longer simply the executioner's daughter. She was the executioner reborn, not by duty, but by desire. And when the masks of the carnival glittered under torchlight, she would slip among them, unseen and unstoppable, her silence honed sharper than steel. The apprentice had become the master. And soon, the nobles who once jeered at her bloodline would discover that death, once confined to the scaffold, could just as easily be delivered in the middle of their laughter. The carnival was at its height when the killings began. Torches licked the night sky, and fireworks thundered overhead, scattering sparks like falling embers across the square. Drummers pounded in rhythm, jugglers tossed fire, and the noblemen, drunk with wine and arrogance, strutted in their jeweled masks as though the city itself bowed before them. The people laughed, sang, and cheered, unaware that death had already slipped silently into the celebration. She moved among them like smoke, formless, invisible, unseen. Her mask was plain, a black cloth stitched with nothing but shadow, blending her into the throng. Where others sought to shine with gold and feathers, she became what no one noticed. She carried nothing that would draw suspicion, only the small blades she had honed to perfection, hidden in folds of her cloak, each one ready to taste blood. Her heart was steady, her breathing measured. She had rehearsed this night 1,000 times, and now she was not afraid. Her first target was Lord Vaynar, the lion-masked tyrant who had gorged on the lives of peasants until their bones cracked beneath the weight of his greed. She watched him bellow with laughter, holding a servant by the neck, forcing wine down the man's throat until he choked and collapsed. The crowd around him roared, not with disapproval, but with the kind of sick delight that comes from watching cruelty disguised as sport. She stepped closer, her movements hidden by the noise. When the servant crumpled to the ground, she guided Vaynar into the shadows, whispering like a promise in his ear. He followed, thinking her a woman offering more indulgence. The alley swallowed them whole. There she struck. One swift slash across his throat, precise, clean. His roar died in a wet gurgle, blood spilling across his lion mask, dripping into his silken cloak. His body slumped silently, his eyes still wide in shock, as though he could not comprehend that death dared touch him. She left him in the shadows, a feast for rats, and returned to the crowd before his absence was noticed. The second fell minutes later. Sir Albrecht, the bronze-masked commander, swaggered through the square, boasting of battles he never fought. She shadowed him as he stumbled into a quieter street, relieving himself against a wall, his hand still gripping a goblet. He never saw her until her hand pressed against his mouth, silencing him, while her blade slid across his neck in one fluid motion. Blood spilled down his uniform, soaking the medals he wore with false pride. She held him until his body stilled, then lowered him gently to the ground, as if mocking the mercy he had never shown others. The carnival raged on, oblivious. Fireworks bloomed overhead, masking the muffled struggles, while laughter drowned the sound of dying men. She moved through it all like a shadow, each step deliberate, each kill rehearsed in silence long before the night began. Count Rudin fell next, his mirrored mask reflecting the torchlight as he slipped behind silk curtains with a trembling maid. The girl escaped when she entered, bolting into the crowd with fear in her eyes, but Rudin did not escape. She pressed him to the floor, her blade flashing once, twice. His blood spilled across the silks he used to conceal his sins. She left him sprawled, his mirrored mask now reflecting only death. One by one, the nobles disappeared. Some followed willingly, mistaking her presence for temptation. Others were pulled aside by a whisper, a brush of her hand, a promise of secrecy. Each time, the blade did its work, quick, efficient, merciless. Throats opened like ribbons, red fountains staining cobblestones, silks, and masks alike. Each body she left behind was not random, but deliberate. Each man had been chosen, and she remembered their sins as she ended them. The bishop's brother tried to resist. He sneered when she lured him away, drunkenly muttering a prayer as though God himself would intervene. But his prayer ended in a choke as steel kissed his neck. He died clutching at his chest, his blessing hand soaked in crimson, his last words dissolving into gurgles. The killings were not without risk. Twice, she was nearly seen. Once when a noblewoman stumbled into an alley where she had just ended her fourth victim. The woman gasped, but before she could scream, the executioner's daughter leaned close, whispering words that froze the woman's blood. "You saw nothing. Speak, and you'll join them." The woman fled, trembling, never daring to look back. Another time, a guard passed close by, torchlight flickering over her cloak. She lowered her head, blending into the throng, her blade hidden against her wrist. The guard moved on, oblivious. By the time the 10th noble fell, the air itself seemed heavier, as if the carnival had grown restless, though no one yet understood why. Some revelers whispered about missing faces, but the music drowned suspicion, and the nobles who remained drank deeper, danced harder, eager to ignore the unease that crept into the square. The 11th and 12th deaths came quickly. One noble collapsed in his own vomit, his throat cut before his companions noticed he had vanished. Another was dragged into the shadows while flirting with a masked woman he mistook for a courtesan. She left his body propped against a wall, his mask tilted upward as though he still watched the fireworks overhead. And then, the 13th, the final act. The man wore a mask shaped like a golden sun, rays stretching outward as if mocking the darkness around him. He was the wealthiest among them, a man whose coffers were filled with the labor of the starving. She waited until he stumbled drunkenly into the square's edge, surrounded by sycophants who praised his every word. She approached silently, her cloak brushing against theirs, her mask blank and unseen among their splendor. When he turned, she guided him gently away, her hand soft against his arm, her voice low and inviting. He followed, laughing, unaware that the shadows already reached for him. In the quiet of the alley, she looked into his golden mask, the reflection of torchlight dancing across its rays. For a moment, she paused, not in hesitation, but in recognition. This man was the embodiment of everything she despised: arrogance, greed, cruelty disguised as nobility. She leaned close, whispering the words her father once told condemned men on the scaffold. "It will be quick." Then she drew the blade across his throat in one smooth stroke, ending his laughter forever. 13 nobles. 13 sins. 13 throats slit beneath the glow of carnival lights. By the time the bodies began to be discovered, she had already blended back into the crowd. The square erupted in confusion as a servant stumbled screaming from an alley, drenched in blood. Another cry rose when a body was found slumped against a wall, throat open, mask soaked red. One by one, the carnival's joy shattered into chaos. Musicians dropped their instruments, dancers scattered, mothers clutched their children. The torches that once lit celebration now illuminated carnage, casting long shadows over the cobblestones slick with blood. The screams grew louder as more bodies were found. Nobles tore away their masks, desperate to prove they were not marked for death. Guards pushed through the crowd, their swords drawn, though they had no idea whom to strike. Some shouted that a demon had entered the carnival. Others swore it was the devil himself taking vengeance. And yet, amidst the chaos, she remained unseen. Another mask, another shadow, her cloak blending into the madness. The carnival was broken. Where laughter once rang, only terror remained. The crowds surged like a storm, trampling, shoving, fleeing from an enemy they could not see. The torches flickered wildly, their flames dim against the rising smoke of fireworks overhead. Blood and wine mingled in the gutters, indistinguishable in the torchlight, flowing together as if the city itself bled. And in the silence of her mind, she knew she had succeeded. The carnival, once a celebration of noble power, had become her stage of judgment. The 13 who believed themselves untouchable now lay cold, their throats open to the night. She had taken back the laughter stolen from her childhood. She had carved her name not with ink, but with steel. The executioner's daughter vanished into the chaos, her mask still plain, her cloak still dark. To the crowd, she was no one. To history, she was unforgettable. Dawn broke over the city like a wound, pale and sickly against the smoke that still lingered from the carnival's torches. The streets were quiet now, emptied of laughter, emptied of music. Only the echoes remained, screams fading into silence, footsteps scattered in panic, the ringing confusion of a night that had turned to slaughter. The cobblestones were stained, not with wine, but with blood. 13 bodies lay cold in the alleys, their jeweled masks soaked crimson, their fine garments stiff with death. The first light revealed the truth no reveler could deny. The nobles were not missing. They were dead. And not just dead, executed. Each throat slit with surgical precision, each cut clean and final. It was the mark of a hand trained in death, not of drunken violence or chaotic rage. Whispers spread like wildfire. This was no accident, no brawl, no demon descending from the heavens. This was a reckoning. The guards dragged the bodies into the square, laying them out in a grotesque procession, their masks removed for all to see. Some onlookers wept, not for the nobles, but for the fear of what would follow. Others stood silent, their eyes gleaming with a dangerous kind of satisfaction. The nobles had feasted on the people for too long, and now 13 of them lay dead, stripped of their untouchable aura. The city was divided, not by blood spilled, but by the meaning behind it. The hunt for the killer began before the sun fully rose. Torches lit the alleys again, not in celebration, but in pursuit. Horses thundered through the streets, soldiers stormed into homes, searching, questioning, threatening. Every mask left behind at the carnival was examined, every cloak scrutinized. Whispers of the black mask spread like a curse. Eyewitnesses claimed they saw a figure dressed in shadow, faceless among the glittering nobles. Yet no one could say for certain. Some insisted it was a man, others swore it was a woman. Still others claimed it was no mortal at all, but vengeance itself. By mid-morning, suspicion coiled like smoke around her. She had not hidden perfectly. There were eyes that remembered glimpses of her cloak, her presence near the nobles who vanished, her movements too deliberate. The noblewoman who had stumbled upon her in the alley spoke in trembling tones, naming a woman of plain mask and quiet demeanor. The guards followed the trail, their questions sharp, their anger sharper. By noon, the executioner's daughter was seized. Her arrest was as violent as the night itself. They dragged her from her small dwelling, shackled her wrists with iron, and paraded her through the streets. Crowds gathered, shouting, spitting, cursing, or, in some corners, silently watching with eyes that did not condemn. She held her head high, her expression calm, her lips silent. Not once did she plead, not once did she cry. To those who looked closely, she appeared not as a captive, but as someone who had already accepted her fate. The trial was announced within days. The nobles who survived demanded swift justice, their voices trembling not with grief, but with outrage. Their world had been pierced, their illusion of safety shattered. To them, the killings were not just murder, they were humiliation. How could 13 men of wealth and power be butchered like cattle beneath their own carnival lights? Their fear cloaked itself as righteous fury, and they demanded her death. But the people whispered differently. In the markets, in the taverns, in the dark corners of the city, her name was spoken with reverence. They called her the Avenger, the Shadow's Justice, the Executioner reborn. To them, She was not a monster, but a savior who had dared to strike where none else could. For every noble throat slit, a dozen peasants felt a wound avenged. Their hatred of her was not hatred at all. It was a fragile admiration, spoken in secret, hidden from the ears of the guards. The courtroom was heavy with smoke and fear. The nobles sat high, their robes thick with gold, their rings glinting like shackles of wealth. She stood below them, shackled, her face pale but unflinching. The charges were read: treason, murder, sacrilege. 13 counts, one for each throat she had opened. The prosecutor's voice thundered, describing her as a creature of darkness, a demon who reveled in blood. They painted her not as a woman, but as an abomination. And yet, when she was asked to speak, she did not deny it. Her voice, calm and steady, carried through the hall like a blade sliding free of its sheath. "Yes," she said, "I killed them. I slit their throats as they once slit the lives of others. I gave them no more mercy than they ever gave the poor, the starving, the broken. They danced while children died in the streets. They drank while mothers buried their sons. Last night, they answered for it." Gasps filled the chamber. Some recoiled in horror. Others could not hide the flicker of agreement in their eyes. Her words were not the ravings of a madwoman. They were the testament of someone who had lived under cruelty and finally struck back. The judges did not care. Her eloquence was wasted on ears clogged with wealth. The verdict was inevitable: guilty. The sentence: death by the blade. It was not irony lost on her. She, the daughter of an executioner, would end beneath the same steel her father once wielded. And yet, the city itself did not quiet. The people whispered louder, emboldened by her defiance. Graffiti appeared on walls, 13 for the thousands. Songs hummed in secret taverns, praising the woman who had carved justice from noble flesh. Even as the nobles condemned her, she became larger than her crime. She became legend. As she was led from the courtroom, chains clinking, she did not look defeated. She looked victorious, her eyes calm, her lips curved in the faintest of smiles. For she knew what the nobles could not see. Their fear had already marked the beginning of their end. 13 deaths were not enough to topple them, but they had cracked the illusion. If one woman could kill 13, what could 100 do? What could 1,000? The aftermath of that night was not silence. It was the first tremor of rebellion. And though the executioner's daughter was condemned, though her body would be offered to the blade, her name had already escaped their grasp. She was no longer a woman. She was a myth. The blade that ended her life was not the end of her story. If anything, it was the beginning. When her head fell beneath the executioner's sword, the crowd that gathered did not cheer with the relief the nobles expected. Instead, silence hung heavy in the air. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men stood with clenched jaws, and even the poorest in the square looked at her fallen body not with hatred, but with a strange reverence. The nobles thought they had erased a monster. Instead, they had birthed a legend. Stories began to spread almost immediately. In the markets, whispers told of how her eyes had never closed after death, staring defiantly at the sky as if mocking the lords who condemned her. Children repeated tales of her spirit walking the alleys at night, still wearing her black mask, her blades dripping with blood not yet washed away. Some swore that whenever a noble fell ill or suffered misfortune, it was her hand guiding fate from beyond the grave. She was no longer flesh and bone. She was vengeance itself, eternal and untouchable. The nobles worked furiously to erase her memory. Her name was struck from the records, her dwelling burned, her family silenced. Public decrees warned against speaking of her deeds, declaring it treason to honor her. But their efforts failed. The more they tried to erase her, the more she grew. She became a ghost story whispered in taverns, a warning told in the barracks, a secret prayer muttered by the oppressed before sleep. To the common people, she became something more than human. Some called her the Black Mask, others the Shadow's Bride. To peasants who suffered under hunger, she was Saint 13, patron of the betrayed. Candle-lit shrines began to appear in hidden cellars, small altars with scraps of cloth dyed black, bowls of water stained red with wine, and crude carvings of a woman holding a blade. Her worship was not sanctioned, yet it thrived in secrecy, fed by desperation. In the decades that followed, rebellions rose, and her name was painted on banners. Soldiers carried her memory into battle, shouting her words. I gave them no more mercy than they gave the poor. When uprisings were crushed, the nobles claimed victory, but the whispers always returned. Each revolt rekindled her ghost, reminding rulers that the executioner's daughter had proved the unthinkable, that power could bleed. Writers and poets took her story and twisted it into ballads. In some songs, she was a demon, seducing men into shadows before tearing their throats apart. In others, she was a holy avenger, sent by divine will to punish corruption. Her image shifted depending on who told it. To nobles, she was the nightmare that justified harsher laws. To the oppressed, she was proof that justice, even brutal, was possible. Generations passed, but her legend refused to die. In some villages, girls wore black masks during the harvest festival, daring to mimic the shadow who had once walked among nobles. Parents frightened children into obedience by whispering, "The black mask comes for liars in the night." Yet those same parents, under their breath, prayed to her when famine came, asking the avenger to turn her gaze against the lords who hoarded food. Even centuries later, when scholars uncovered fragments of the trial records, her name still stirred controversy. Was she a murderer or a martyr? A monster who slit throats in cold blood, or a woman who finally struck back at a world built on cruelty? History offered no simple answer. What survived was not the facts of her life, but the weight of her story. Her tale illustrates a paradox, the thin, trembling line between justice and vengeance. To some, justice must come through law, trial, and order. To others, when laws are built by tyrants, true justice must come from the shadows, from the hands of those who dare to strike without permission. The executioner's daughter embodied that paradox, her blade carving a question into history that has never fully healed. When does murder become justice? The carnival where she struck was never held again in its original form. In time, the nobles banned masks altogether, fearing the anonymity that once gave her power. Festivals grew tamer, stripped of the wildness that had allowed her to blend in. Yet the ban only deepened her mystique. Each masked reveler in later centuries carried the ghost of her memory, as if she might return at any moment, slipping once more between shadows to punish arrogance. And so her legend lived not in books, but in fear and hope. Fear, for those in power who looked over their shoulders at night, wondering if the black mask would return. Hope, for the powerless who lit candles in the dark, whispering her name when justice seemed impossible. Today, her story lingers like a haunting. Historians dissect her motives, true crime enthusiasts examine the brutality of her acts, and storytellers like us resurrect her memory. Was she a cold-blooded killer reveling in the slaughter of 13 nobles? Or was she a broken daughter, shaped by cruelty, who gave voice to the voiceless through her blade? Perhaps she was both. But one truth remains unshaken. The night she struck, the world shifted. Power, once thought untouchable, was exposed as fragile. 13 noble throats proved that even the highest towers can fall, and that sometimes justice is written not in ink, but in blood. And in the whispers of alleyways, in the echoes of hidden songs, in the trembling fear of those who exploit the powerless, the executioner's daughter still walks, her mask plain, her blade sharp, her legacy eternal.